The Move, Look, and Listen podcast with Dr. Doug Stephey is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download by visiting audibletrial.com/inbound. We'll have a link in the episode notes for your convenience. Many of the books mentioned here in the podcast are available in Audible. Sign up for a free 30-day membership trial, and you can download any book you like. Support the Move, Look, and Listen podcast with Dr. Doug Stephey by visiting audibletrial.com/inbound.
If our two eyes are not working together well as a fast, synchronized team, our internal map quest continues to be off. It's consistently inconsistent with our ability to judge time and space. Those that don't feel well grounded, those that have some measure of anxiety, oftentimes it starts in the visual system. If you can't move, look, and listen in a fast, accurate, effortless, sustainable, age-appropriate, meaningful way, you're in a world of hurt. There's a whole world in vision and how it affects brain function that no one's ever shared with you. 2020 is perceived as the holy grail of going to the eye doctor. Well, I'm here to change that paradigm. Welcome back to the Move, Look, and Listen podcast. I am your host, Dr. Doug Stephey. We have a returning guest today, Dr. John Stein. He's a neurologist, MD from Oxford. Today's topic, we're going to be talking about math learning disabilities or dyscalculia. Dr. Stein, welcome back.
I'm very pleased to be back.
So for those who have listened to other episodes with Dr. Stein, you know that we really took a deep dive into the magnocellular neuron system, magnocellular auditory neurons, magnocellular visual neurons, magnocellular motor neurons. And this topic has been kicked around in my office recently for a little while, and Dr. Stein graciously agreed to come back today and to do this episode about math learning disabilities. So with having said that, I'm going to take just a second to read at least one definition of dyscalculia. It is a term associated with specific learning disabilities in math. Although features of learning disabilities in math vary from person to person, common characteristics include difficulty with counting, learning number facts, and doing math calculations, difficulty with measurement, telling time, counting money, and estimating number quantities, and trouble with mental math and problem-solving strategies. So that is a reasonably simple definition, I suppose, of the term math learning disability. I think we should start the episode with the kind of testing that might be conducted, perhaps, to define somebody with a math learning disability. What's been your experience with how that is approached, or how is a student diagnosed with a math learning disability?
Well, can I start by saying I think there is a confusion in this field in that to a neurologist such as myself, dyscalculia, or rather acalculia, is a fundamental problem with, let's call it numerosity, the number sense. Most of us have an inherent number sense or an ability to subitize, as it's called. That is to say, when you see a collection of three things, be it 3 trees, 3 strawberries, 3 apples, you recognize the threeness of them, that is to say, the number of them, and that's an abstract property which doesn't have anything to do with, what did I say, strawberries, trees, or whatever. And some people have a real problem with that. That develops into a problem with numerosity, or the concept of number. Now, I think that is the definition of dyscalculia that should be at the bottom of all the other definitions, because it's very easy to confuse this kind of number sense problem with the problems that arise from dyslexia, where you have not a problem with understanding number, or the concept of number, but you have a problem with seeing the order of the numbers or the order of the pluses and minuses or division signs. And so you have a problem with calculation, not as a consequence of a problem with subitization or numerosity, but a problem with actually reading and remembering the order of the symbols. And I believe that the sort of definition that you've just read out, accurate as it is a bit misleading because it doesn't distinguish the numerosity problem from the order of symbols problem. So, to answer your question in detail, I would say that you need to have specific tests of subitization to actually be sure that you've got somebody with dyscalculia. But that's seldom done. Normally speaking, people are said to be dyscalculic because they're bad at calculations and so on. And that can easily be the consequence of a dyslexic problem rather than a dyscalculic problem. Do you see what I'm getting at?
I see exactly what you're getting at. So to clarify, the subskill of subitizing is to recognize an approximate number of things by a quick glance or a quick flash without even knowing language. And some of the reading that I was doing in preparation for today's episode, I thought it was really intriguing because they gave an example of showing an infant 3 pictures, one with, let's say, a single dot, one with 2 dots, and one with 3 dots. And then they played like a drum beat with 3 beats in it, and that the infant would look at the target with the 3 dots.
Yes.
Right? Doesn't know numbers, doesn't know language, doesn't know anything hardly, but it's thought to be related to this ancient approximate numbering system that we inherently are born with.
Exactly. But some people are not. And actually, it's very rare not to be born with it.
And I also think it's really intriguing that they gave the example of, let's see, pigeons, elephants, rats, and I forget what else. But the point being, though, is that this approximate numbering system is not peculiar to humans.
Yeah, monkeys is probably the other one you were thinking of, because it was first shown in birds to extend from humans, then monkeys, and then the other animals you mentioned, yeah.
So truly, in the strictest sense, the dyscalculia student would be identified really as one who has a subitizing deficit.
Absolutely. That's, in my opinion, where it should remain. But as I say, the kind of definition that you use doesn't confine it.
No, it does not. That seems to be the ongoing confusion about, in this case, a math disability versus quote unquote dyslexia or reading disorder. And we've discussed in previous episodes about how confounding the definition of dyslexia is, and that it's been watered down so much that it's almost meaningless at this point.
Yes.
And this seems to be on a similar note. So from your experience, is it estimated that 3 to 6% of the population might have subitizing deficits?
No, I think it's more like 1 in 1,000 has an inherent selective subitizing deficit. It's very rare, but the definition of dyscalculia, which has become almost a maths deficit, I think, as I say, confuses the subitization problem with things that develop as a consequence of the sequencing problems that dyslexics have.
To your understanding, as it relates to the rarity of a subitization deficit, do you know if it's believed to be some genetic link?
I don't think it's been studied, or it's not as common among children. I mean, the reason it received its original definition was that you get acquired acalculia as a result of certain brain lesions. which can remove your subitization ability or your numerosity ability, but leave your reading ability intact. And the problem is that what you might call the numerosity area is so close to reading areas that you seldom get a lesion that specifically removes subitizing area, as it were, in the posterior parietal cortex.
And then is it your understanding that subitizing deficits are trainable?
Well, not in the case of the acquired version, no, because you've lost that particular part of the brain. But you can, to some extent, redeem it by training, that's true. But the basic subitizing problem you can't get after you've had the lesion. But on the other hand, if we're talking about the wider use of the word dyscalculia, then it certainly is amenable to training.
So as it relates to the concept of subitization, what kind of numbers are we talking about in terms of grouping to be able to see at a glance that it's an approximate number of this many?
We talk about the magical number 7 because 7 numbers is something that you can easily pick up. And it's a bit like telephone numbers. We're quite good at 7 numbers, but we get it wrong if we try and remember 9 on just one glance.
And then just to clarify again for the listening audience, if we were to do a measurement of subitization, I think the most classic example would be I'm going to present a specified number of dots randomly on a computer screen.
Yeah.
Briefly. So I think I've read anywhere from 100 milliseconds to 200 milliseconds. So these number of objects are going to briefly flash on the screen, and then you've got to input an answer about how many dots did you see?
It is important that it shouldn't be longer than 200 milliseconds because you've got to catch them in one glance.
And then, of course, there's the input speed. I flash the number. You've got to tell me the correct answer. And do you know if the response time is calculated in determining if you've got a subitizing deficit, or it's just the accuracy of what you can do?
It should be both the response time and the number, because the response time is shorter, the better your subitizing is. But then, of course, you've got to take into account the differences in people's reaction, motor time as well. So ideally, you take out the motor response time as well.
And then here's an interesting concept, and I'm delighted that you're here to talk about this, because as I have contemplated subitization skills in the past, and because these images are flashed briefly, I can't help but wonder if there's a relationship between subitizing deficits and magnocellular vision dysfunction. Do you know if anybody's studied that?
Not that I know of, but I think the prediction would be that if anything, dyslexics with a magnocellular deficit would be better at subitizing than others. I haven't seen any evidence that this is the case, but the prediction would be that because you are not depending upon timing to see the different 3 spots, but you are seeing them all at once, you're mainly using your parvocellular system. And there's some evidence that the parvocellular system of dyslexics with magnocellular deficits is superior to ordinary brains. So the prediction would be if you could do a pure subitizing test, which didn't depend upon a sequencing of any sort, then dyslexics should be slightly better. But I don't think that's ever been shown. I'm just speculating here.
If you had a magnocellular deficit and you could not see fast, it wouldn't affect your ability to see all the gestalt of the dots in one glimpse?
What do you mean by see fast? I mean, the magnocellular system allows you to sequence fast. But when you're looking, one of the strengths of dyslexics is definitely when you are looking at a whole scene holistically, you're actually better if you've got a slight magnocellular deficit, because your parvo system is more powerful.
So I've got a couple other things for us to talk about. It goes back to the early 1920s when subitizing, I wouldn't say first discussed, but discussed anyway some time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it got described as a developmental prerequisite to counting and number concept, and that those who have poor subitizing skills are also likely to have poor number sense, poor basic arithmetic skills, and perhaps do poor in higher mathematical concepts. And I don't think there's anything that goes against the grain of what we're talking about that relates to those kinds of discussions.
Yeah, well, the only thing I would take issue with is higher mathematical functions, because actually, let's say geometry and highly abstract algebra depends on being able to see patterns rather than sequence things. And in fact, dyslexics, well, we all think Einstein, for instance, was dyslexic, and he was very good at seeing patterns and doing high multi-dimensional algebra. So I don't think it necessarily leads to the higher order of mathematics, but it certainly does to the basic things you're talking about.
And I would agree with that, because I've got a couple of kids in my practice over the years who I would describe as profoundly dyslexic, and for our purposes, dyseidetic dyslexic. And the kids that I'm thinking of, they struggled with basic arithmetic and basic math facts, but they did well in the higher order conceptual thinking for the reasons that you're describing, which then also, I think, goes to the core issue of recognizing, in part, because I'm thinking back about some other kids that I've seen over my years in practice, and they invariably were really good about thinking about math in their head. So if I was a teacher at the head of the class describing a concept, the kids that I'm referring to already know the answer when the teacher's got the problem halfway written on the board. But what they cannot do is put their work on paper.
Yeah, they can't tell you how they did it.
Yep.
Because they're doing it in a different way from the way the teacher's trying to teach. They're doing it because they spot a pattern in their incredible minds. And that's what Einstein could do, and what a lot of dyslexic super mathematicians can do.
And the unfortunate part about that is that if that's not recognized, those kids are punished because they can't put their work on paper, right? They don't get credit for their brilliant mind. And I think it's really torturous for them. And certainly it is ego busting to have the right answer and not get credit for it. And when the teacher says, well, you didn't put your work down on paper, and the kids can't articulate how they got the answer. They just intuitively understand math in a way that most of us don't get. Yeah. And if you don't think about math in that manner, you have to break it down into steps. And these kids can't do that and can't articulate why they can't do it.
Yes, as I always say, ordinary minds have to do it in a plodding linear way. People who can see patterns in many dimensions, i.e. dyslexics, don't have to do that. That means they can see solutions to problems that the ordinary linear way just doesn't see.
Well, that's probably why, in the best of circumstances, the folks that have that pattern perceiving ability end up being the CEO of a company, and they get a bunch of sequential thinkers to work for them.
Exactly.
So what other factors besides subitizing can be confounded with a math learning disability?
Well, I think actually some features of dyspraxia can be confounded with it. What's become clear now is an awful lot of cognition is much more motor than we believed in the past. So one of the ways that is very important for teaching arithmetic is actually doing things, tapping or actually drawing the letters in sand or whatever. If you are poor at that kind of thing through dyspraxia, which also is confused with dysgraphia, you can have something that is confused with dyscalculia because there's this huge overlap.
And on a related note, I would imagine that if you've got working memory deficits, that can lead to problems with math outcomes.
Oh, absolutely. But those working memory deficits are very often the result of dyslexia, because working memory very much depends upon this Magno system again, because it's tracking.
And are there standalone visual spatial considerations, do you suppose, that contribute to math learning disabilities? Or does the visual spatial get subsumed under the working memory category?
As I think we discussed in a previous podcast, visuospatial has a number of aspects to it. And if the visuospatial tasks that you're talking about require a sequential kind of approach, for instance, if you're trying to, for instance, work out the sequence of events in a series of pictures, then that's going to be affected by a Magno deficit, because Magno system underlies sequencing so much. But if the visuospatial task that you're thinking of is one that depends upon you grasping all the features of a big scene at once, then dyslexics, well, magnocellular kind of dyslexics will be better at it.
All right. So as we kind of maybe head into the tail end of this today, dyscalculia, in its strictest definition, is the presence of a subitizing deficit.
Yeah.
Maybe one in roughly 1,000.
Yeah.
That it seems to be, subitizing seems to be a skill that is amenable to training unless it's acalculia subsequent to a brain injury.
Yeah.
That it relates to basic arithmetic and the concept of number sense, the subitizing issues. There's confounding factors that get lumped with the math learning disability or dyscalculia diagnosis, but those issues are just confounding the cleanest definition that we're discussing today.
But when I say just, it doesn't mean they're not important. It means that we've got to adopt a different approach to their treatment.
You know, I think one of the most common things that I find when I'm interacting with parents or other disciplines or the educational system, I have to make sure that we are defining terms in a common way, right? If I'm saying apple and you're thinking oranges, then we are not finding common ground to discuss a particular student's outcomes and how to plan for their educational needs. So we really have to be clear about the terms that we mean. And also then that I've come across some statistics that would suggest that roughly 50 to 60% of the dyslexic population can currently have math disabilities as well. And you've alluded to much of the same thing.
Yes, absolutely. But I want to be clear that having math disabilities doesn't necessarily mean you've got pure dyscalculia. It can mean that your math disabilities are a consequence of the sequencing problems that you get because you have a magnocellular weakness.
And I think more to the point, which is exactly why I've titled this podcast Move, Look, and Listen, that there are other confounding factors other than just subitization that still may result or contribute to why you're having poor math outcomes. And similarly, if you've got math and or reading disabilities, we have to fully understand the root cause of why you're manifesting those outcomes, rather than just giving you more instruction in deficit areas when the instruction that you're being provided, you're not benefiting from?
Yes, I think it's really important to understand, whatever you call it, the reasons for a child's maths difficulties, and make sure that you adapt your program for helping him or her to what actually is going on. And therefore, giving them a label of dyscalculia and then using a one-size-fits-all program to try and help them is sometimes worse than useless.
Yes, I would agree wholeheartedly, right? Because the common denominator in this hub is the student themselves.
Exactly.
So if they're provided with different kinds of instruction without understanding the root cause of their problem, I think it really undermines their ability to develop a sense of ego. And they start to wonder, how stupid must I be that I'm being provided all this help and I still don't get it?
Yeah.
And that's the whole point of, I think, really most of these podcast episodes, is to let people know that there is help, that it might be really different than what you've been led to believe, and that you keep seeking answers and get to the root cause of what's happening so that we can help those kids in a way that they're not currently being helped. So as we wrap up today's episode on dyscalculia and math learning disabilities, I think the thing that we're in agreement on is that each of these students is uniquely their own, and we need to understand their learning profile as it relates to their abilities to move, look, and listen, and then structure a therapy intervention that's going to help them obtain the inabilities to move, look, and listen in a fast, accurate, effortless, sustainable, age-appropriate, meaningful way, so that when we go to then provide them with, in this case, math instruction, they've got the fundamental tools to be able to benefit from the instruction now that they're receiving.
Yeah, I entirely agree. Putting it another way, every dyslexic, every dyscalculic is different and an individual. And we've got to find out what is the mix of particular deficiencies they have in order to develop a program to help them.
Having said that, Dr. Stein, thank you once again for coming back to the Move, Look, and Listen podcast. I really appreciate your insights and your expertise. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Move, Look, and Listen podcast with Dr. Doug Stephey. All of the resources mentioned in this podcast and links to learn more about our guest can be found in the episode notes from whichever podcast app you might be listening with. You'll also find a link to Dr. Stephey's website, which is stepheyoptometry.com. That's STEPHEY optometry.com. You can also call the office at 626-332-4510. We'd like to take a quick moment to thank our sponsor, Audible. If you love podcasts, you'll love listening to audiobooks with Audible. Many of the books mentioned here in the podcast can also be found at Audible. Dr. Stephey has a free audiobook waiting for you as a gift just for listening to the Move, Look, and Listen podcast. Simply click the link in the show notes to audibletrial.com/inbound. Sign up for a free 30-day membership trial, and you can download any audiobook you like. And if for any reason and at any time you choose to cancel your membership, you get to keep all of your audiobook downloads. It's risk-free and for free for 30 days. Support the Move, Look, and Listen podcast by visiting audibletrial.com/inbound. We really do appreciate you listening. And until next time, for Dr. Stephey of the Move, Look, and Listen podcast, I'm Tim Edwards with the Inbound Podcasting Network.